There is a man on his hands and knees in the wet grass, and the dew is soaking through what is left of his clothing, and he does not feel it. His hair has grown long and matted, twisted into ropes that hang past his shoulders like the coarse feathers of some enormous bird. His fingernails have not been cut in so long that they have curled, thickened, yellowed, hooked over the tips of his fingers like the talons of an eagle, and as the light comes up grey over the fields outside the city, he lowers his face to the ground, and he tears at the grass with his teeth, and he eats. Now hold that picture, because that man is not a beggar. He is not a madman pulled from some forgotten village. That man, on his knees, chewing grass with the animals, that man built the most magnificent city the ancient world had ever seen. He commanded armies that swallowed nations whole. He burned the temple in Jerusalem to the ground and carried a whole people into exile in chains. He was, by any measure that mattered in his own age, the single most powerful human being alive. And here he is, in the field, eating like an ox. You know this story. Or you know a piece of it. If you grew up in church, you were probably handed the outline once, in a children's lesson or a sermon aside, the proud king who got humbled, who went mad for a while, who ate grass until he learnt to bow. A morality tale. Pride goes before a fall, and then the page turned, and you never thought about it again. But the version you were handed was the surface. Underneath it there are questions the pews were never told about, and they are stranger and older and far more unsettling than the tidy lesson. Why 7 years? Why does the text describe an angelic being it never names anywhere else in the whole Hebrew Bible? A being that belongs to a book most Christians have never read? And here is the one that should stop you cold. 2,000 years ago, someone sealed a small stack of Aramaic writing into a jar and hid it in a cave in the cliffs above the Dead Sea. It sat there in the dark until a shepherd stumbled onto it in the middle of the last century, and when scholars finally pieced the fragments together, they found a story that is almost this story. The same 7 years, the same divine sentence, the same isolation, the same praise of God at the end. Almost the same. Except for one detail. The King in the Caves version has a different name. We are going to walk all the way into that. I want to show you what the words actually say in the language they were written in, what history can and cannot confirm, and why some of the most serious scholars alive think the man in the field may not have been the king you were always told it was. I am going to be honest with you the whole way, about what is certain, what is likely, and what is only a guess dressed up as a fact. Because the truth here is stranger than the legend, and it does not need to be exaggerated. If you want to walk through this with me, take a moment and subscribe, and turn on notifications, so the next part of the story finds you when it comes. And do something for me before we go on, leave a comment, and tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I like knowing who is out there in the dark with me. So let us go back to the field, and the king, and the words, and let us begin where the strangeness begins. Part 1. The King Who Told on Himself. Open the Book of Daniel to its 4th chapter, and the first thing you notice, if someone points it out to you, is that the king is doing the talking. That is not how these stories usually work. Ancient kings do not confess. They commission monuments. They carve their victories into stone and leave out their defeats. When a Babylonian ruler wanted the future to remember him, he had scribes record the temples he restored and the walls he razed. And he said nothing whatsoever about the nights he lost his mind. That was the whole point of a royal inscription. It was propaganda in baked clay. And yet Daniel 4 opens like a letter. Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. It is a royal proclamation, a circular letter sent out across the empire, and its author is the king himself. And what does this most powerful man on earth choose to announce to every nation under his rule? Not a conquest, not a temple. He announces that God broke him, that he was driven out among the beasts, that he lost his reason and got it back only when he finally looked up. The king is telling on himself, publicly, in the first person. That framing alone should make you lean in, because it is so strange. But before we go further, you need to know something about the language on the page, something that will matter enormously by the end of this. If you read Daniel in an English Bible, it flows seamlessly, chapter after chapter, as though it were all written the same way. It was not. Slice into the middle of the book, from the 2nd chapter through the 7th, and the Hebrew stops. The text switches, mid-sentence in the original, into a different language entirely. Aramaic, the common tongue of the ancient Near East, the language of merchants and diplomats and empires, the language Jesus himself would speak centuries later. The story of the king in the field is not written in the sacred Hebrew of most of the Old Testament. It is written in Aramaic. And that seam in the text is a clue that these court tales may have lived and travelled on their own before they were ever gathered into the book we hold. Hold on to that. It is going to come back. Because here is the question this whole chapter hangs on. And it is a question hiding inside a single word. The king is sentenced to live as a beast until, in the old phrase your Bible probably uses, 7 times pass over him. 7 times. Everyone assumes that means 7 years. Preachers say 7 years. Study Bibles print 7 years. But that is not quite what the word says, and what it actually says is where this begins to open up. Part 2. The word that will not say years. Here is the detail nobody talks about. The Aramaic behind that famous phrase is a word you have never heard. Idan. 7 Idanin were to pass over the king. And Idan does not mean year. Go to the lexicons, the great scholarly dictionaries where the meaning of every ancient word is weighed and argued. Open them to this word, and what you find, at the root, is not a measure of years at all. You find time. Period, season, an appointed span. A stretch of time whose length is set by something outside itself. The word is deliberately, almost teasingly open. It tells you that a fixed period was decreed. It does not tell you how long. So where did 7 years come from? It came from readers, ancient and modern, doing exactly what you would do, reaching for the most natural way to fill the gap. A season could be a year. 7 of them, 7 years. It is a reasonable reading. It may even be the right one. But watch how the ancient translators themselves disagreed about it, because this is where it gets interesting. When the Book of Daniel was carried out of the Aramaic world and rendered into Greek for the wider Mediterranean, it was translated more than once, and the translations do not match. One of the great Greek versions, the one called Theodotion, refused to pin the word down. It kept the ambiguity intact and wrote faithfully 7 seasons. 7 times, just as vague in Greek as it had been in Aramaic. But an older Greek version, the one scholars call the Old Greek, did something else. It made a decision. It closed the door on the ambiguity and wrote, flatly, 7 years. Do you feel what just happened there? The certainty you were handed in church, the confident 7 years, is not the reading of the original. It is the reading of one ancient translator who chose, out of the fog of that open little word, to name a number. The oldest interpretation, yes, may be the correct one. But an interpretation, the text itself, in the language it was written in, holds the length of the punishment just out of reach and will not quite tell you. And that is the first thing the surface version hides. The story is more careful, more deliberately mysterious than the sermon lets on. The number was never nailed down. Someone nailed it down for you. But if the length of the sentence is uncertain, the one who handed it down is described with terrible precision, because in the king's dream, before any punishment falls, something comes down out of heaven, and the word the text uses for it appears nowhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible. Part 3. The Watcher Who Came Down from Heaven. Every part of this story so far has been a matter of language and history. This part is different. This part is where the ceiling of the room lifts up and you see how high it goes. In the dream, the king sees a tree, we will come back to the tree, and as he watches, something descends. The text calls it, in Aramaic, an ear, and beside that word it sets another, Kaddish, a watcher and a holy one coming down from heaven. And it is this being who pronounces the sentence, who speaks the decree that the king will be driven out to live as a beast. Now that word, watcher, should stop you, because of where it does and does not appear. Search the whole Hebrew Bible, every book, every chapter, cover to cover, and you will find that word used for a heavenly being in exactly one place. Here, in Daniel 4. Nowhere else. Not in Genesis, not in the Psalms, not in the prophets. The angels of the rest of the Old Testament are called by other names, messengers, hosts, sons of God. This word watcher, the one who does not sleep, the one who keeps vigil over the affairs of men, it surfaces once in the dream of a Babylonian king, and then it is gone. So where does it come from? Where was this word at home? It was at home in a body of writing that most Christians have never opened, and that is not in the Bible you own. I want to be very clear about this because the whole worth of what we do here depends on not blurring the line. There is a book called the Book of Enoch. It is ancient, parts of it are older than Daniel. It was treasured by many Jews in the centuries around the time of Christ. Fragments of it were found in those same caves above the Dead Sea, but it was not accepted into the Hebrew scriptures, and it is not in the Old Testament that Protestants and Catholics and Jews read today. It sits outside the canon. And in that book, in its opening section, which scholars actually call the Book of the Watchers, these beings are everywhere. There, the Watchers are a whole order of heavenly beings who keep watch over the earth. In Enoch's telling, a company of them rebel and come down and father monstrous children and teach humanity forbidden things and are judged for it. Now, I have to be careful and fair here, because it is easy to sensationalize this and I promised you I would not. The Watcher in Daniel is not one of Enoch's rebels. In Daniel, the Watcher is holy. He comes down not to corrupt the earth but to carry out the sentence of the Most High. His role is the opposite of the fallen ones. But do you see what has happened? The Book of Daniel, sitting inside your Bible, has reached out and picked up a word, a whole category of being, from the strange, vast, uncanny world of Second Temple angelology, from the same current of imagination that produced Enoch's watchers and giants and the secret architecture of heaven. For one verse, the curtain between the tidy world of the sermon and that older, wilder world pulls back, and through the gap you can see the watchers keeping their sleepless vigil over the kingdoms of men, and deciding that one proud king has to be brought down among the animals. That is not a distortion of the text. That is the text. The being who sentences Nebuchadnezzar belongs to the most mysterious layer of ancient Jewish imagination that exists. And the sentence he pronounces falls on something the king saw first as a tree so vast it fed the whole world. Part 4. The tree that filled the earth. Before the Watcher speaks, the king dreams of a tree. And this is no ordinary tree. It stands, he says, in the middle of the earth, and it grows until it is strong and its height reaches to heaven, and it can be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves are beautiful, its fruit is abundant, in it is food for everything that lives. The beasts of the field shelter in its shade, the birds of the air live in its branches, and all flesh is fed from it. And then the Watcher comes down and says, cut it down, strip its leaves, scatter its fruit, drive out the animals, but leave the stump in the ground, bound with a band of iron and brass, out in the grass of the field. If that image feels like it is reaching for something cosmic, it is. The tree that stands at the centre of the world and holds up the sky is one of the oldest pictures in the human imagination, and the ancient Near East was full of it. but you do not have to leave the Bible to find its twin. Turn back a few books to the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 31, and you will find another great tree. A cedar, towering over all the trees of the field, its top among the clouds, all the birds nesting in its branches, all the beasts sheltering beneath it, the envy of every tree in the garden of God. And that cedar too is a proud king. It is Pharaoh, ruler of Egypt. And it too is cut down for its pride, brought down to the grave for lifting its heart up because of its height. The parallel is so close that some scholars think the writer of Daniel had Ezekiel's cedar open in front of him. The same towering tree, the same universal shelter, the same fatal pride, the same felling. It is the ancient world's great and terrible image for a king who mistook himself for the centre of creation. And there is an older echo still, further back, in the oldest story humanity ever wrote down, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In it there is a wild man named Enkidu, made by the gods, who lives out in the wilderness among the animals, who runs with the gazelles and eats grass with the beasts and drinks at their watering holes, until he is made human, civilized, brought in from the wild. Daniel's king travels that same road, only backward. He is a civilized man, a king, the peak of human order, and he is unmade, sent back out into the grass to run with the beasts, the most human of all men, turned into the wild man. I will be honest that scholars argue about how tightly that echo really binds. It may be a deep shared instinct rather than a borrowed line, but the shape is unmistakable, and it tells you what the story is really about, because underneath all of it there is a single idea, and it is the beating heart of the whole chapter. In the very beginning, in Genesis, the human being is given dominion, set over the animals, crowned to rule the creatures of the earth as the image of God. That is the height of what a human is. And Nebuchadnezzar, standing on the roof of his palace, looking out over the greatest city on earth, says the words that damn him, "Is not this great Babylon, that I have built by the might of my power, for the honour of my majesty? I made this, by my strength, for my glory." And in that moment the man who was meant to rule as God's image claims to be the source of his own greatness, and heaven answers by stripping the dominion away and sending him down among the very animals he was meant to rule. The image of God, unmade into a beast, until he learns the one thing the whole chapter exists to teach, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. That is the story. That is what the text says, plainly, and all of it is solid ground. But now we have to leave the page and ask the harder question, the one that made you click. Did it happen? And if it did, why is there not a single line about it anywhere in the vast records of Babylon itself? Part 5. The silence in the clay. Here is where a lot of confident videos start telling you things that are not quite true. I am not going to do that. I am going to show you exactly what we have and exactly what we do not, and let you feel the real shape of the mystery instead of a fake one. We know an enormous amount about Nebuchadnezzar. This is not a shadowy figure at the edge of legend. He was one of the best documented rulers of the entire ancient world. He reigned for more than 40 years, and the ground of Iraq is still full of his fingerprints. He rebuilt Babylon into a wonder, the great processional way, the blue-glazed Ishtar Gate with its rows of dragons and bulls, which you can go and stand in front of in a museum in Berlin right now. He raised the enormous stepped temple tower at the city's heart, the one many believe lies behind the memory of the Tower of Babel. Archaeologists have dug up his bricks by the tens of thousands, and a staggering number of them are stamped with his name, so that the very walls of the city spelled out Nebuchadnezzar over and over. There are long inscriptions in which he boasts, at length, about everything he built. We have his own words about his own reign. And in all of it, in every brick, every inscription, every boast, there is not one word about the king going mad and eating grass in a field. Now, the tempting thing to say next is, of course there isn't. They covered it up. They erased it. A humiliation like that would have been struck from the record. And you will hear people go further and claim that there is a suspicious gap in the Babylonian documents late in his reign, a stretch of missing years that lines up perfectly with his 7 years in the field, as if the silence itself were the proof. I have to tell you the truth. That claim does not hold up, and if I fed it to you, I would be doing the same thing I am asking you not to trust from anyone else. Here is the honest picture. The main year-by-year Babylonian record of this era, the great chronicle scholars rely on, breaks off early. It covers the first 11 years of the reign and then it simply stops, not because of a scandal, but because the clay tablet that carried the rest is lost, or was never preserved, or lies broken somewhere we have not found. That same gap is why the Babylonians left us no account of the destruction of Jerusalem either, one of the most important events of the age. And their records are silent on it too. The silence is not aimed at the madness. The silence covers almost everything from the back half of the reign. It is the ordinary, frustrating silence of a broken record, the same silence that swallows huge stretches of ancient history. Reading it as a deliberate cover-up is reading a secret into an empty page. So the honest position is this: the Babylonian record does not confirm the king's madness, and it does not deny it either. It simply does not reach that far. And that is a more interesting truth than a conspiracy, because it means we have to look somewhere other than Babylon's official monuments. Which is exactly what people have tried to do. In fact, there is one particular tablet that gets waved around constantly as the smoking gun. So let us go and actually read it. Part 6. The tablet that says almost nothing. There is a broken piece of clay in the British Museum, catalogued under a dry inventory number, that you will find cited again and again as external proof of Nebuchadnezzar's madness. I want to take you right up to it, because it is a perfect lesson in how a real object gets bent into something it is not. The tablet is genuine. It was dug out of the ground in the 1880s and published by a serious scholar in the 1970s. And it is a wreck. Only a fraction of the original survives. Maybe a sixth of it. The rest crumbled away. But on the fragments that remain, you can read some genuinely startling lines. The name Nebuchadnezzar appears, and near it phrases that his life had come to seem worthless to him, that he gave contradictory commands, that he would not listen to his counselors, that he showed no love to son or daughter, that he neglected the great temple. And then, prayers to the god Marduk. Read that cold, and it does sound like a man coming apart. It sounds like the Daniel story leaking into the historical record. And that is exactly how it gets used. But here is the part the confident videos leave out. The scholar who actually edited that tablet, who handled it, who read the signs, who published it, did not think its subject was Nebuchadnezzar's madness at all. He read the broken text as being mainly about the bad behaviour of a different king, Nebuchadnezzar's own son and successor, and about that son's improper conduct toward the temple, followed by a change of heart and prayers. Nebuchadnezzar's name appears, but as part of the setup, not as the deranged man in the grass. The reading that turns this tablet into a documentary confirmation of Daniel came later, and it came not from the people who study cuneiform for a living, but from writers looking to shore up the Bible story. Even they admitted it was one possible reading of a hopelessly damaged text. So what is this tablet, honestly? It is a broken, ambiguous fragment that mentions a Babylonian king behaving strangely and neglecting a temple, and that its own editor connected to the wrong king for our purposes. It is not proof of anything. It cannot bear the weight that gets stacked on it, and I would rather hand you an honest empty hand than a fake full one, which leaves the historical case for the madness exactly where the last part left it, unconfirmed, unrefuted, silent, and so people have gone looking for an answer in a completely different direction, not in the clay of Babylon, but in the human mind. They have asked, if a man really did behave this way, what would we call it today? Part 7. The doctor who said he watched a man eat grass. There is a name for it. Or there is a name that gets used for it, which is not quite the same thing, and the difference is the whole story of this part. When people reach for a modern medical explanation of Nebuchadnezzar, the word they usually grab is boanthropy, from the Greek for ox and man, the delusion of a person who believes he has become a cow or a bull, and behaves like one. Out in the field eating grass, it is a tidy, satisfying word. It sounds clinical, it sounds like a diagnosis, and it makes the whole strange chapter feel suddenly explicable. Oh, it was a known mental illness, the poor man was sick. But I have to slow you down here, because I promised you the honest version, and the honest version has edges. First, boanthropy is barely a medical term at all. You will not find it as a recognised diagnosis in the manuals psychiatrists actually use. It is more of a popular coinage, built specifically to fit this story. The real recognised condition, the one that appears in the psychiatric literature, is broader, and it is called clinical lycanthropy. It is the rare delusion that one has transformed, or is transforming, into an animal. Any animal, most famously a wolf, which is where the word comes from, but the literature records people who believe they had become dogs, cats, birds, and yes, cattle, and here is the second thing, the important thing. This condition is real, but it is extraordinarily rare, and the serious research is at pains to say so. One landmark study out of a major psychiatric hospital combed through its records across many years and found only a handful of genuine cases, around a dozen, and noted that they did not point to a single underlying illness, but tended to accompany severe psychosis of various kinds. A more recent review went back through nearly 2 centuries of medical writing, gathered every reported case it could find of a person believing they had turned into an animal, and concluded that only a small fraction of them even met the strict definition of the condition. The reviewer's blunt point was that clinical lycanthropy has been wildly overestimated in the popular imagination, that it is one of the rarest things in the whole catalogue of human delusion. So the medical lens is real, it is not nonsense. It is genuinely possible to describe a modern patient whose experience resembles the king in the field. But notice what we are doing when we say Nebuchadnezzar had clinical lycanthropy. We are reaching 2,500 years across time to hang a modern label on a stylized, theological, first-person royal proclamation. A text that was never trying to give us a case history. We cannot examine the patient. We cannot take a history. We have a story with a message, not a chart. Retrospective diagnosis of the ancient dead is a game everyone loves, and no one can win. And there is one more thread I have to pull, because it runs through nearly every telling of this story, and it deserves the light. There is a famous claim, repeated endlessly, that a respected scholar once said he personally observed a real case of boanthropy, a patient in a British mental hospital in the 1940s, a man who went out and ate grass in the grounds of the institution, whose hair had grown long and whose nails had thickened like an eagle's claws, exactly as Daniel describes. It is a stunning anecdote. It shows up in book after book, sermon after sermon, as though it closed the case. And when you try to actually verify it, to find the patient, the records, the medical publication, anything, there is nothing there. It is a single second-hand story told once by one man with no documentation behind it, no case notes, nothing that anyone else could ever check. It may be perfectly true, but a story you cannot verify is not evidence, no matter how many times it is repeated. And it gets repeated precisely because it is so satisfying. I am not telling you it is false, I am telling you it is unconfirmed, and that the difference matters, and that anyone who hands it to you as proof is asking you to trust a rumour. So we are left, still, without a solid historical anchor for Nebuchadnezzar's madness. The record is silent, the tablet is broken, the diagnosis is a guess across the centuries, and you might think that is where the trail goes cold. It is not. Because there is one more piece of evidence, the strangest of all, the one I have been holding back since the very beginning. It came out of a cave, and it is about to change which king we are even talking about. Part 8. The Wrong King. Come with me to the cliffs above the Dead Sea, to a cave in the crumbling rock, sometime in the 1950s, where scholars are bent over a table trying to fit together the pieces of a scroll. It is small, only 4 fragments of Aramaic, brittle and broken, the edges eaten away by 2,000 years. It was written before the time of Christ, and hidden among the great library of scrolls that a Jewish community sealed into those caves. And when the scholars work out what it says, they realize they are reading something they were not prepared for. It is a prayer. It is written once again in the first person, in the voice of a king of Babylon. And the king is telling how he was struck down by the decree of God Most High and set apart from other men for a period of, you already know, 7 years. And how at the end, after he prayed, a Jewish man came to him, forgave his sin, and told him to give honor to the Most High God. A Babylonian king. 7 years. A divine sentence. Isolation from other men. A Jewish figure who intervenes and interprets. A first-person royal confession that ends in the praise of the God of Israel. If you did not know the name at the top, you would swear you were reading a rough draft of Daniel 4. But you do know the name. Because that is the whole point. The scroll is called, by the scholars who study it, the Prayer of Nabonidus. And the king telling the story is not Nebuchadnezzar. His name is Nabonidus. And he was a real king of Babylon, the last one in fact, the man on the throne when the empire fell. In the prayer, his affliction is not madness. The broken Aramaic seems to describe a terrible lingering illness, an evil inflammation or ulcer that plagued him through those 7 years. And he did not spend them in a field outside Babylon. He spent them, the prayer says, in a place called Teman, an oasis, out in the Arabian desert, far from his capital. Now sit with what this means, because it is genuinely one of the most remarkable finds touching the Book of Daniel that exists. Here, in a scroll older than the New Testament, hidden in a cave, we have a story with the same skeleton as Daniel 4, the same 7 years, the same divine judgment on a Babylonian king, the same exile from human company, the same Jewish holy man, the same turn to the Most High at the end, but attached to a different king entirely. And not just any different king, the king who came right after Nebuchadnezzar's line. The last king of Babylon. The obvious question hits you like cold water. Which came first? And did somebody, somewhere, take a story that was really about Nabonidus and give it to the more famous Nebuchadnezzar? I want to be careful and fair, because this is exactly the kind of place where it would be easy to overplay my hand. This is a hypothesis. It is not a proven fact, and I will show you both sides. But it is not a fringe idea. Either it is taken seriously by some of the most serious scholars who have ever worked on these texts. And to see why it is so tempting, you have to know what the real Nabonidus actually did. Because it turns out, the desert was not a legend. The desert was history. Part 9. 10 years in the desert. Here is the thing about Nabonidus that almost no one in the pews has ever been told. The strangest detail in that cave scroll, the king leaving his throne and disappearing into a desert oasis for years, is not fiction. It happened. And we can prove it from the king's own hand. Nabonidus did something no Babylonian king was supposed to do. He left. Early in his reign, for reasons scholars still argue about, he packed up and marched out of Babylon into the Arabian desert, to that very oasis, and he stayed there, not for a season, not for a year, but for roughly 10 years. And we do not have to take a legend's word for it, because Nabonidus left inscriptions in which he says it himself. In his own royal words carved in stone, he describes leaving his city and going out to that string of desert settlements and staying away, year after year, not entering Babylon. And the consequences of that absence are written all over the record. Babylon's most important religious event was the Great New Year Festival, and it could not be performed without the king present. The Babylonian Chronicle notes year after bitter year that the king was not in Babylon, that the festival did not take place, that the ceremony was cancelled because the king stayed away in the desert. Something like a decade of Babylon's sacred calendar simply went dark because the king would not come home. And to run the empire in his absence, Nabonidus left his son behind in the capital to rule in his place, a son named Belshazzar. If that name rings a bell from the very next chapter of Daniel, hold that thought, because it should. Now here is the piece that turns the whole thing electric. After Nabonidus fell, after Babylon was conquered, the new regime and its supporters wrote about him, and they did not write kindly. They produced a savage account of his reign, and in it they painted him as a man who had gone wrong in the head. Impious, deranged, a king who abandoned the proper gods, who did strange and unstable things, who was in effect mad. This was propaganda, written by his enemies to justify his overthrow. But do you see what it means? It means that even in ancient Babylon itself, entirely apart from the Bible, there was already a tradition of a Babylonian king who left his throne, vanished into the desert for years, and was remembered as having lost his mind. That tradition existed. It attached in history to Nabonidus. This is the kind of thing this hour lives for, and it is why I keep insisting on the honest version instead of the flashy one. Because the honest version is better. We have a real king, historically documented, who really did leave his throne and spend about a decade isolated in a desert oasis, whose own absence darkened his empire's holiest rites, who left his son ruling in Babylon in his place, and whom his own countrymen remembered as having gone mad. And we have a scroll from a cave that tells that king's story with the same 7-year shape as Daniel 4. The pieces do not just resemble the Bible story, they resemble it in ways that history can actually confirm. Which brings us, at last, to the great question, the one scholars have been arguing over ever since that scroll came out of the cave. If the desert king was really Nabonidus, then how did the man in the field end up with Nebuchadnezzar's name? Part 10. How a story changes its king. Let me lay the possibilities out plainly, and fairly, because this is a real debate among real scholars, and I am not going to pretend it is settled when it is not. The first possibility, and it is the one a great many scholars find most persuasive, is that the story was transferred. That there was an older tradition about the strange king who was struck down by God and exiled from his people, and that the king in that tradition was originally Nabonidus, the one who really did vanish into the desert, the one his own people remembered as mad. And that over time, as the story was told and retold among Jews in exile and after, the obscure last king of Babylon was quietly replaced by the towering, unforgettable one, Nebuchadnezzar, the king everyone remembered, the king who burned the temple, who carried Judah into captivity, whose name was a household word. It is a very human thing for a story to do. The famous name swallows the forgettable one. Nabonidus fades. Nebuchadnezzar takes his place in the field. Some of the most respected names in the study of these texts have argued for exactly this, and it is, right now, something close to the mainstream scholarly reading. But it is not the only reading, and honesty requires the others. A second possibility is that Daniel and the cave scroll are not parent and child at all, but cousins, two branches growing from one older root that shared tradition of the mad Babylonian king, each developing in its own direction, neither one copied from the other. On this view, nobody swapped the names on purpose. The two stories simply drifted apart from a common ancestor, one keeping Nabonidus, the other landing on Nebuchadnezzar. And there is a third possibility, argued by scholars who read the evidence the other way round entirely. They suggest the cave scroll is actually the later text, that it was written after Daniel, in conversation with it, perhaps even trying to fill in the gaps, or smooth the theology of the biblical story. On this reading, Daniel comes first, and the prayer of Nabonidus is a response to it, not a source for it. I will not pretend to settle for you what the experts have not settled among themselves. and I want to be especially fair to those, often more traditional readers, who point out, correctly, that the two stories are not identical. One king has an ulcer, the other eats grass. One is in a desert oasis, the other in the fields by his city. The names are different, and they argue that these differences mean the cave scroll is simply a separate Jewish tale about a different king, and that it does nothing to undermine the historical truth of Daniel's account. That is a legitimate position, honestly held, and you should weigh it. But whichever way you come down, something has shifted under your feet, and it cannot shift back. The simple picture, the proud king, the grass, the lesson, the end, is gone. In its place is something far richer and stranger, a story that travelled, that changed kings, that has a twin sleeping in a cave, that reaches back into a real desert exile and a real reputation for madness that history can actually touch. The version you were handed in church was true as far as it went. It just never told you it had a shadow. And here, as the intensity of all that begins to settle, there are a few quieter echoes still worth walking through before we let the story rest. Part 11. What the Greeks half remembered. Away from the caves and the cuneiform, there are two faint voices from the classical world that people love to bring into this story, and it is worth hearing them for what they are, not proof, but faint and fascinating echoes, worn smooth by long retelling. The first is a Babylonian priest who lived a few centuries after Nebuchadnezzar and wrote a history of his people in Greek. His original work is lost. We only know what he said because a later Jewish historian quoted him, and we only have that historian because still later writers preserved him. A quotation of a quotation, and in it this priest says that near the end of his life Nebuchadnezzar fell ill and then died. That is all. An illness at the end. No grass, no field, no 7 years of beasthood, just a king who sickened before he died. It is thin, and it does not really match, but people reach for it because it is the closest thing to an outside confirmation that the great king's final years held some kind of affliction. The second echo is stranger and even fainter. Another late writer, again surviving only because someone else quoted him centuries afterward, tells of Nebuchadnezzar climbing to the roof of his palace and there being seized, possessed, the text says, by some god, and crying out a prophecy that Babylon would one day fall, before he vanished from sight. It is a haunting little scene, and you can feel how it drifts in the same current as Daniel's rooftop boast, and the humbling that follows. But it is a ghost of a ghost, passed through so many hands that we can build almost nothing solid on it. I mention it because it is part of the story's long afterlife, not because it settles anything, and that afterlife is its own quiet wonder. The Greek version of Daniel, as we saw, told the tale in its own longer, rearranged way. The Jewish historian who preserved the priest retold the whole episode again for his own readers, and down through the centuries the image of the grass-eating king kept its grip on the imagination, a proud man on all fours in the wild, brought low. Many centuries later an English poet and artist would take up that image and make it unforgettable, a great colour print of Nebuchadnezzar as a naked, wild-eyed figure crawling on his hands and knees through the dark, his beard grown long and tangled, his fingers ending in curved claws, his body half animal, his face frozen in terror. If you have ever seen it, you never forget it. It is Daniel 4, rendered in dread and beauty, the exact picture we opened with at the very start in the wet grass at dawn. The story would not let go of people. It still does not. And now, having walked all the way down into it, you know why. It was never only a children's lesson about pride. It is a text with a borrowed angel from a forbidden book, a punishment measured in a word that will not name its own length, a twin sleeping in a desert cave, a king whose name may not be his own, and a real ruler who really did vanish into the sand. So let me leave you with the thing underneath all of it, the the one truth the whole strange chapter keeps circling back to. A man stood on a rooftop and looked out over everything he had built and said, in effect, I made this, by myself, for my own glory. And the oldest, deepest claim of the story is that this is the one lie a human being cannot live inside. That the moment we mistake ourselves for the source of our own greatness, the moment we forget that the breath in our lungs and the ground under our feet were given, not earned, something essential drains out of us, and we begin, quietly, to become less than human. The king did not turn into a beast because God was cruel. He turned into a beast because he had already begun, in his heart, to believe he was a god. The field only made visible what the pride had already done, and his healing did not come when he grew stronger. It came at the lowest possible point, on his hands and knees in the wet grass, when at last he lifted up his eyes. That is the whole of it. He looked up, and his reason came back to him. There is a strange mercy buried in that, and it is offered to everyone who has ever built a great Babylon out of their own life and called it theirs. But there is a thread here we have not followed, and it leads straight out of this story into another one. Remember the sun. Remember the boy Nabonidus left ruling in Babylon while he vanished into the desert, Belshazzar. Because there is a night, in the very next chapter, when that name throws a great feast in a doomed city, and a hand with no arm appears out of the empty air and writes 4 words of fire on the wall of the palace, in a language no one at the table can read. No one, that is, but an old man they had almost forgotten. That is a story that begins exactly where this one ends, and it is even stranger than this one. I hope you will be there in the dark with me when we walk into it. Until then, rest well and keep looking up.